There is a photograph I cannot stop thinking about. It was taken in 1885, somewhere in the Ohio River Valley, by a man whose name the archive does not record. In it, 3 men in waistcoats and suspenders stand beside an open excavation pit. They are holding measuring rods. And in the pit, partially uncovered from the earth, is a human skull. The skull is roughly the size of a watermelon. Not a large watermelon. A very large watermelon. The men's expressions are not theatrical. They are not performing wonder. They look like men who have just found something they do not entirely know what to do with. I found this photograph buried in a private collection in rural Pennsylvania. It had no institutional provenance. No accession number. No chain of custody. That is where this story begins. Not with the giants. With the absence of the giants. Because here is the thing that nobody in the official record wants to explain. There are thousands of documented discoveries, excavation reports, coroner's filings, State Historical Society entries, Smithsonian field dispatches, and front-page newspaper stories, describing the recovery of human skeletal remains far outside the accepted range of human variation. 7 feet. 8 feet. In a handful of cases, measurements approaching 9. These reports span a century of American history. They come from credentialed sources. They describe material evidence. And the material evidence, in case after case after case, has vanished from every publicly accessible collection on Earth. That is not archaeology. That is something else. I spent 11 months trying to understand what that something else might be. What I found did not give me answers. It gave me a shape. A silhouette of something very large that someone worked very hard to make invisible. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not 1885. Further back. Much further. The mounds of North America are among the most misunderstood archaeological features on Earth. There are more than 200,000 of them, earthen monuments scattered across the eastern half of the continent, concentrated most heavily in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. The largest of them, Monk's Mound at Cahokia in southern Illinois, covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built by human hands, basket load by basket load, over centuries. Who built them is a question that has generated more political heat than archaeological light. In the early 19th century, the dominant American theory, embraced by politicians, theologians, and amateur historians with equal enthusiasm, was that the mounds were the work of a vanished race. A pre-Indian civilization of superior attainment. A lost race. This theory was useful. It was useful because if the mounds were built by a people who had since disappeared, they were not the heritage of any living Native American nation. They were, in effect, ownerless. Available for whatever narrative the new nation needed to tell about the land it was occupying. The lost race theory was eventually dismantled by serious archaeology. By the late 19th century, researchers had accumulated enough evidence to establish clearly that the mounds were built by the ancestors of living Native American peoples. That conclusion was correct. That conclusion was important. And the process of arriving at it was legitimate science. But something happened inside that process. Something that has not been adequately explained. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, under the direction of John Wesley Powell, launched the most comprehensive mound survey in American history between 1881 and 1894. Dozens of researchers fanned out across the continent. They excavated hundreds of sites. They recovered thousands of artifacts and thousands of sets of human remains. They shipped everything to Washington. The Bureau's mandate, stated plainly in Powell's own correspondence, was to settle the mound builder question once and for all. And they did. The mounds were Native American. The science was clear. But the science required something else as well. It required that the anomalies be explained. And the anomalies, it turns out, were not so easily explained away. The part that keeps me up at night is a single document. It is the 1894 report of the Bureau of Ethnology, authored primarily by Cyrus Thomas, the Smithsonian's chief mound investigator. The report runs to 730 pages. It is a monument of 19th-century scholarship. And buried in its appendices, in the dense small print that nobody reads, are references to skeletal remains of unusual dimensions recovered from sites across Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and West Virginia. The language is careful, bureaucratic, clinical. But the measurements are there. 7 feet 2. 7 feet 8. One entry, from a mound near Wheeling, West Virginia, that Thomas describes without elaboration as, of a stature not consistent with the population of the region. Not consistent with the population of the region. Thomas does not say what stature, precisely. He does not say where the remains were sent. He notes only that they were collected and forwarded to Washington in accordance with standard bureau procedure. I tried to find them in Washington. I spent 3 weeks working through the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History. The finding aids for the Thomas expedition materials run to 46 boxes. Those boxes contain correspondence, field sketches, artifact photographs, and shipping manifests. They do not contain any skeletal material matching the appendix descriptions. There are no intake records. There are no storage location codes. There are no transfer documents indicating the specimens were moved, studied, or disposed of. They are simply not there. The timeline isn't subtle. Thomas's report was published in 1894. The specimens it references were collected between 1882 and 1892. In 1893, the Bureau of Ethnology reorganized its collections. In that reorganization, according to a memo I found in Box 17 of the Thomas Papers, certain categories of material were reclassified and transferred to a separate holding facility. The memo does not specify which categories. The memo does not specify which facility. That memo is dated March 14, 1893. Speaking of 1893, that was also the year of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the great World's Fair that presented American civilization to the world. The Smithsonian had a major exhibition presence. Mound culture artifacts were prominently displayed. The narrative being told was a specific one: the mounds were Native American, the mound builders were known, and the archaeological story of North America was largely settled. That narrative required settled edges. Anomalies do not have settled edges. Let me be fair to the institutional logic here. I understand why a scientific organization in 1893 might choose to subordinate confusing outliers to a clear and socially important conclusion. The conclusion, that the mounds were Native American, not the work of some vanished superior race, was the right conclusion. It was fighting a racist mythology. It needed to be argued cleanly, without qualification, without the kind of ambiguity that pseudoscientists could exploit. But here's what matters: suppressing anomalies to protect a correct conclusion is still suppression. And the anomalies, in this case, were human remains. They were physical evidence. They belong to the scientific record. And they are gone. Let's talk about what the newspaper record shows, because it is more extensive than most people realize. The New York Times, which I want to emphasize is not a publication associated with fringe claims, ran at least a dozen stories between 1851 and 1915 describing the excavation of unusually large human remains from American soil. On December 20, 1897, a Times dispatch from Sayre, Pennsylvania reported the recovery of 3 skeletons from a burial mound by a team that included a state historian and members of the Presbyterian Church's American Exploration Society. The remains were measured at between 7 feet 2 and 7 feet 6 inches. The skulls had, the report noted, bony projections above the brow ridge approximately 2 inches in length. The Bradford County Historical Society in Sayre, Pennsylvania holds records of this excavation. I contacted them. They confirmed that excavation records from that period exist. They confirmed that the mound site was documented. They could not confirm the location of any physical specimens recovered from that excavation. Their records indicate the specimens were forwarded to the American Exploration Society in Philadelphia. The American Exploration Society dissolved in 1902. Its collections were distributed to several institutions, the records of which are incomplete. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. The pattern repeats in Warner, New Hampshire, where an 1885 excavation documented by the New Hampshire Antiquarian Society recovered remains described as belonging to an individual of approximately 7.5 feet. The Antiquarian Society's records survive. The specimens do not appear in any inventory I could locate. The pattern repeats in Crittenden County, Arizona, where an 1891 excavation, reported in the Arizona Weekly Gazette on March 5 of that year, recovered a stone sarcophagus containing a mummified figure described by the site's excavators as approximately 12 feet in length. The excavators were identified by name. The site was identified by location. The sarcophagus was described as bearing hieroglyphic-style inscriptions. There is no subsequent institutional record of this specimen anywhere in the American Southwest's major archaeological collections. The pattern repeats in Brush Creek, Ohio, where Smithsonian-affiliated researcher Charles Peabody documented in his own field notes the recovery of skeletal material of unusual dimensions from a mound complex in 1896. Peabody's field notes survive in the Harvard Peabody Museum archive. The specimens his notes describe do not appear in any Peabody Museum inventory. Speaking of Charles Peabody, there is a letter he wrote to a colleague in 1901 that I want to describe carefully, because I only have access to a partial transcription of it, and I do not want to overstate what it says. In this letter, Peabody apparently expresses frustration with what he describes as the disposition of certain classes of material from the mound collections. He uses the phrase, institutional preference, in a context that suggests specimens were being selectively retained or discarded based on criteria that were not purely scientific. The letter is held in a private collection. I have not seen the original. I have seen a transcription made by a historian in the 1970s, who described it as suggestive but not conclusive. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And the pattern, when you map it geographically and chronologically, has a shape. The reports cluster in the decades between 1870 and 1920. They cluster in the geographic zones of heaviest Smithsonian mound excavation activity. They cluster in publications and institutional sources that had professional reputations to protect and therefore limited incentive to fabricate. And they are followed, uniformly, by institutional silence. Let me bring in a different kind of evidence. Because the archival record is one thing. The oral record is another. The Paiute nation of the Great Basin has preserved, across generations, an account of a people they called the Ctacah. In the oral tradition recorded by ethnographer Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins in her 1883 memoir, the Ctacah were a red-haired, cannibalistic race of giants who waged war against the Paiute and their allies for generations. The allied nations eventually drove the Ctacah into a cave and burned them out. Winnemucca Hopkins recorded this not as mythology but as ancestral history. Her account predates the discovery I am about to describe by 41 years. In 1912, workers mining guano from a cave in Humboldt County, Nevada, a cave the local Paiute called the Cave of the Ctacah, began finding artifacts. Baskets. Weapons. Mummies. Duck decoys woven from bulrushes so sophisticated that modern archaeologists have dated them to approximately 2,000 years ago and can still find no comparable pre-Columbian basketry in North America. The cave was Lovelock Cave. And when the University of California and the Nevada Historical Society conducted formal excavations in 1912 and 1924, what they found aligned, in certain specific ways, with what Winnemucca Hopkins had recorded 3 decades earlier. The mummies had reddish hair. Not hair that had reddened with age and desiccation. Archaeologists who examined them noted the pigmentation was original. Some of the skeletal remains were of individuals who, in life, would have stood significantly taller than the regional average. The formal excavation reports, housed in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley and the Nevada State Museum, note these characteristics without elaboration and then move on to cataloging the extraordinary basketry and other artifacts, which are genuinely world-class and have received the attention they deserve. The skeletal anomalies have received considerably less attention. I contacted the Nevada State Museum regarding their Lovelock holdings. They confirmed possession of materials from the 1912 and 1924 excavations. They confirmed that skeletal material is included in those holdings. A full specimen inventory, I was told, was not available for external review pending ongoing repatriation consultations under NAGPRA. I understand that answer. NAGPRA is important legislation. Repatriation is a serious and legitimate process. I am not suggesting the Nevada State Museum is engaged in any kind of cover-up. But here's what matters: the combination of that answer and the institutional history I have been describing means that the Lovelock skeletal materials, the materials most directly relevant to the question of anomalous stature and the materials most directly connected to an independently preserved Native American oral tradition, are not available for independent scientific analysis. They have not been available for independent scientific analysis for decades. And nobody in the mainstream scientific community seems particularly troubled by that. Maybe that's fine. Maybe the specimens are ordinary. Maybe they would resolve the question immediately and definitively in favor of the mainstream interpretation. Maybe. But if the specimens are ordinary, making them available for analysis would settle the matter. And they are not being made available. And the pattern of non-availability is consistent across institutions, across decades, across geographic regions. Let me name the institutions that hold relevant materials and have declined, for various stated reasons, to make full specimen inventories publicly available: the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard, the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley, the Nevada State Museum, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Ohio History Center. These are not fringe institutions. These are the central repositories of American archaeological heritage. And across all of them, the documentation connecting 19th-century field reports of anomalous skeletal remains to specific physical specimens held in current collections is absent, incomplete, or unavailable. That is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination. What this looks like, from the inside of 11 months of archival research, is something more diffuse and more durable than a conspiracy. It looks like institutional preference. It looks like the accumulated weight of 100 small decisions. This specimen doesn't need to be prominently catalogued, this measurement doesn't need to appear in the summary report, this field note can be filed without a corresponding intake record, made by individuals who believed, sincerely, that they were protecting the integrity of a correct conclusion. And maybe they were. Maybe every specimen that went unrecorded was genuinely unexceptional. Maybe every measurement that disappeared into bureaucratic ambiguity was a measurement error. Maybe the 1,500 newspaper reports were all, every one of them, the product of the very human tendency to exaggerate, to mythologize, to find in the ground the confirmation of stories we already want to tell. Maybe I am seeing patterns where none exist. But I keep coming back to Harold, the retired archivist who first showed me the shape of this gap. He said something to me in our last conversation that I have not been able to put down. He said, "In 30 years of working with historical records, I learned that archives don't lie. They can be incomplete. They can be damaged. They can be poorly organized. But when you find a systematic pattern of incompleteness, the same kind of gap, in the same category of material, across multiple institutions and multiple decades, that's not entropy. Entropy is random. Patterns are not. The bones are somewhere. Or they were somewhere, once. The records that would tell us where they went exist, or existed, in filing cabinets and archival boxes in Washington and Cambridge and Berkeley and Carson City. 4 pages missing from the Norris correspondence. A transfer memo with no destination. An intake record with no accession number. A specimen described in a field report that appears in no inventory anywhere on Earth. The lost race of giants. I do not know if they existed. I do not know what they were. I do not know whether the measurements recorded by exhausted men with imprecise instruments in the muddy fields of 19th-century Ohio reflect biological reality or the distortions of imagination and ambition. What I know is that something was found. Something was collected. Something was transported to institutions that exist to preserve exactly this kind of evidence. And something, somewhere in that chain, went wrong in a way that was systematic, and patient, and thorough. I don't have answers. I have a photograph of 3 men standing beside an open pit, holding measuring rods, looking at something large in the earth with expressions that are not theatrical. I have a shape where something used to be. And once you see the shape of an absence, you cannot stop seeing it everywhere you look.